Hello, this is Karen White of Divine Time Astrology, and I have Channing Ayers here today of Channing Ayers Astrology. Channing has been doing some research into what is happening now with the Saturn Jupiter conjunction in Aquarius and putting it in a larger context so we can understand. We'll give some explanation in some of the tumultuous things that have been happening this past year and where we are headed, where humanity is headed. Now, there's always going to be ups and downs and negative things and positive things, but we're still moving in a positive direction overall. So, Channing, are you ready? You want to tell us what is going on and like what context that you are personally putting it in as a result of the research you've been doing on the major time cycle of the planets?
Hi, Karen. Thanks.
Hi, Channing.
All right. Well, to put the the big time cycle into context is that we are in, according to the system that you and I study, we are in the ascending cycle of the yugas, right? So we have this cycle where our solar system is moving around the center of the galaxy, and then we are either descending, moving towards the farthest point away from the center of the galaxy, or ascending. Now, if you look at this in a sidereal calendar or different philosophies, some people think that we're going to be in the darkest period for about 430 some thousand years. But Sri Yukteswar and some other astrologers have calculated the math a little differently, saying that we've already crossed that threshold and we're now moving towards the source energy, towards the center of
Which
the
means
galaxy.
that when people talk about that we're ascending, that's what they mean.
Yeah, we're either,
Okay.
well, no, that's more of a different term that's being used
Oh,
in different schools of thought. And yeah, I'm not
okay.
an expert on that, so we're not going to talk
Okay.
about that.
So it's not related to the planets necessarily.
No, this is
All right.
more of the yuga cycles are very specific in the Vedic texts and in the Vedic understanding of this journey of humanity, basically. So the human existence um, is either plunging through a descending cycle or an ascending cycle as the solar system is moving. So this is why I have a hopeful and positive slant on any of these periods that we start going through, that they're all moving towards, they're an ascending cycle, so that we're moving towards consciousness, we're moving towards more unity and peace and harmony in these um you know in these events happen. The hopeful piece that comes in there of
Right.
saying we're
Right.
on an evolutionary process. um and we'll see, we have to see how it all goes. What we're experiencing right now, what we had come together to talk about, you and I, is the Saturn Jupiter conjunction that's happening on December 21st, um 2020. And this is kind of a big cycle, a big conjunction of the two slow moving planets. We're not really always using the outer planets specifically,
Mhm.
but the more personal planets, the planets that are more connected with all of the signs, and the slowest moving ones are Jupiter and Saturn. So these two
Right.
are coming together in a conjunction, which happens around every 20 years. It's actually about 19.8 years. And so these two will conjunct almost every 20 years. Um, and what happens is that a bigger cycle is created. So where these planets are conjuncting um, happens in one element, and that element will run for almost 200 years. And this becomes a 200 year in one element, 200 year in the next element, 200 year in the next element. And so it'll cycle through all four elements. And that creates an 800-year cycle. So that's the bigger cycle of what's happening. So what's happening now is that Jupiter and Saturn are moving into the sign of Aquarius, which is the air element. Um, so we had already had one cycle of Jupiter and Saturn in the air element, but it wasn't a consistent cycle. It's what's called the disruption cycle. So when these two start moving into a new element, it will be constantly in one element, constantly in one element, and then boop, it'll move into a different element, and then it'll go back into that original element. And these are disruptions in the
It's,
cycle.
it's interesting that that's the word they use because I was thinking of more like a preview. It's like a
Like a
preview.
little hint.
Yeah.
This is what it's going to be like. It is like a little preview. So we can look back and we can see that Saturn and Jupiter conjuncted in the sign of Libra back in 1980. And so that's a 20-year cycle from 1980 to 2000. We started seeing a little taste of this air element that's going on. And then it went back into Earth. And now this Jupiter Saturn cycle that's happening on the solstice is going to be a permanent crossing over. So it's now going to move into air, and it's going to stay in air for quite some time.
200 years, right?
Yeah, almost the next
Okay.
100 before it disrupts again. And then it'll
Okay.
move into water. And so it'll be air, and then water, and then back to air, and then water
Okay.
permanently. So these are around 200-year cycles, with some disruptions towards the end of the cycle. So these disruption parts of the cycle are the sort of transition time. Um,
Hmm.
and they can create a lot of mixing of the different elements. And then you
It's
move
kind of
more.
like to give us a preview. So get ready. It's kind of nice that nature does that for us, right? It kind of gets us a little, okay, so get ready for the next thing,
Yeah, it's getting
right?
us ready and giving us a little boost and incentive. So in the 1980s through the 2000s, I mean, we can see that was a huge advances in technology. That's when, computers really took off, the internet really got started, cell phones started being everywhere. That was a pretty radical 20-year period where we had a huge movement of technology.
And
And
this is because of the air element, is that right?
potentially, yeah, the
Okay.
the the qualities of the air, okay, the qualities of the air are ones that we would expect to permeate more of that 200-year period. So air is very innovative. It has to do with ideals. It has to do with information. It has very connected with technology. It has to do with things that are revolutionary, things that are new, unique. The air, think of air as the element it is. It's very hard to contain, right? It's everywhere.
Mhm.
It permeates everything. It's crossing boundaries. It's hard to put air in a container and control air. Um, so there's all of these different qualities to that could definitely represent the types of themes that we see in humanity
So
in our.
isn't it also it's related to change, right? Because I'm corresponding it to Saturn, which is the air element, and Saturn rules change. And so it's going to be like Saturn's going to be in Aquarius, and so is Jupiter going to be in Aquarius.
There is also an element of Aquarius that's fixed.
True. It's a fixed
So,
sign. Yeah.
right. So while Saturn definitely represents transitions, change, death, illness, decomposition, all of those types of things are related to Saturn. Um, but the signs, the modalities of the signs also can express fixed, change, dual type of
Mm,
modalities. So what we're
okay.
moving into is we're moving into this sign of Aquarius, um, with Jupiter and Saturn conjuncting, leading the way. Pluto will be the outer planet. Pluto will be trailing behind and moving into the sign of Aquarius in 2024. But that's not too far behind when we think of this as like a 20-year cycle or a 200-year cycle, right?
Mhm.
So, so we have a lot of the qualities of air coming up that can be associated with change, but then we've also got this nature of Saturn and the fixed nature of Aquarius where we might not actually see a lot of quick changes right away, right? Because we've got
Mm-hmm.
this very fixed nature and we're still dealing with Saturn. The first time I had read about these cycles was when I was reading Edith Hathaway's book back way a long time ago, maybe
Yeah.
2009 or 2010. Not the first time I'd heard about these cycles, but the
Which
first
book
time
of hers are you referring to?
it's called In Search of Destiny.
Okay.
Yeah, and
So
she's a
people can
really
get it if they want to.
she's a sidereal astrologer, and but
Right.
she's really neat. She's a really great astrologer, and um, you know what she talked about. She was using the sidereal perspective, and I've sort of stopped using that and
Mm-hmm.
really found a lot more accuracy in the tropical perspective. So
Mm-hmm.
my main focus is on the tropical signs that this is happening in. But she talks about the importance of these conjunctions happening in a couple different ways. One of them is that the conjunctions happening in the sign that the planet rules. So it's happening in Saturn's sign.
Mm.
The other thing is that it's happening on the solstice, which is an ingress. Basically, the sun is moving into the sign of Capricorn. The day the sun moves into the sign of Capricorn is the day of this solstice. And that's another important date to pay attention to. So these sort of, to me, sort of highlight the importance of how this transition is happening and how what these planets are doing, and it highlights the importance of Saturn to me in a big way, and
Mm.
the qualities of Saturn and how Saturn is sort of in charge of everything that's happening right now. And then we also have the North Node over there in the sign of Gemini, which is another air sign. So there's a lot of you know confluences happening here. The air element, Saturn being involved with all of this, um, that's going to sort of flavor the next um, period of the Saturn Jupiter conjunction, but also, especially the next 20 years at the very least, is going to have the sort of Saturn, uh, you know, tone to it.
Saturn in Aquarius.
Saturn in Aquarius, right? And Saturn's very happy in Aquarius. This is a very
Yeah.
happy Saturn, a diurnal sign. It's a day-oriented sign. It's a masculine sign. It's a fixed sign. Saturn is his mula trikona is in this sign. If you look at it from the Vedic perspective, if you look at it from the ancient Western perspective, like the Hellenistic, it's his domicile. It's
Mhm.
very important sign for Saturn. Saturn's actually really highlighted here. He's very strong in this sign. So,
So, taking it back a little bit into history, can you talk a little bit about the last time there was a great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in the sign of Aquarius? Was it during one of the disruptor periods, or are you going to go back to the last time we had air running for 200 years?
well, the disruptor periods come every time. They come with the cycles. So what we had is we had Earth, 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 and then we had a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in sign of Libra. And this is actually how it happened the last time, which was, um, oh, let's see if I have that date written down here exactly. Um, the last time that Saturn and Jupiter conjuncted in the air signs was in the sign of Libra in the year 1186. So that's the last time that the cycle started. So that would correlate with like the 1980s, and for this time around. And then and then it went back into Taurus, and then it conjuncted in Aquarius in 1226. So the 13th century, early
Mhm.
13th century is when that started, when that cycle started, and it ran for 200 years. So we have the 1200s, and then the 1300s is that 200-year cycle. That was a kind of intense cycle in human history. Um,
Tell us
there
some of the highlights, like the good stuff first, okay?
Well, there was definitely, what happened was there was a an awareness, more of an awareness of like what was coined as civic nationalism. So people being more and more aware of um, their own personal freedoms, their own personal liberal freedoms, their people coming more into awareness of that, but also in their freedoms in their own nationality. So there was kind of this awareness there that was kind of like the beginning of the understanding of people becoming more ethnocentric too, understanding where they were from and using that as a comparison for looking at the lens of how they were viewing other things in the world. But there was actually a sort of an opening of understanding about how other people lived in the world. There was sort of this connection. One of the great explorers, Marco Polo, came out of that time, and he went to China and spent 20 years in China and brought back, other people had gone to China before, but he brought back extensive writings about it and a lot of the information. So during that time period, the 1200s and then into the 1300s, there became an awareness of all of these different cultures. Even Buddhism was brought back, and the understanding of Buddhism and into the Western world. And so this opened a lot of doorways into exploration, right? Into wanting to understand more about other cultures and wanting to understand more about how we're different and how we're connected and stuff. Since the air will do that, it'll bring in information. I mean, at that point, we had China had invented gunpowder in the 9th century. They had been experimenting with and using gunpowder, but it was very under lock and key. And that was during the last time we had a fire element, by the way.
Okay.
That happened. So China discovers gunpowder. Well, it's during the 1200s and the 1300s that knowledge of gunpowder starts moving around the globe. So it moves to the Middle East, it moves to the West, or that kind of thing. So the knowledge starts getting shared. The air signs are very much about sharing information and sharing ideas.
Yeah. I was just going to say, in traditional Western, especially in horary, the air element is considered to be a connecting element.
It is. It's a lot like water almost.
Yeah.
Water and air both have this permeable. They don't necessarily respect the boundaries. They can go into all these different places. So water tends to connect people in a very deep way. Like, it brings it all down to the base. And it kind of wants to go in. Air brings everything outward. And it brings it's all over the place, and it's connecting in that way. So it has a similar airs like water all over, that we breathe, right? So there are similarities in these different elements. That's really interesting. So we have a lot of things to look forward to because we're moving into a new cycle. We have been in the Earth cycle, and the Earth cycle we've seen has brought a lot of, it's brought a lot of industry. It's brought a lot of growth of business, growth of government, growth of structures. There's been a massive amount of organization that's happened during the earth element, and now we're moving into an air element, which is all about these, sharing information and ideas, right? And innovations. Now, we do need to also be aware, though, that there's a shadow side to that. Air, all of these elements out of balance can bring different aspects of, the positive and the negative. So
right.
the the aspects of air that are, more shadowy could be disassociation, not being grounded, not being, going deep, being more surface, disassociation, and the emphasis on idealism, not necessarily on practicality, not necessarily on the organization of those ideals. It can be very, the extreme of air is madness, right? So
Great.
we have to watch for these things coming into balance, right?
Aquarius. Have you seen some of that? What have you seen the shadow side of that, like in the past, the last 200-year air cycle?
I mean, gosh, the
Just a few
whole,
things. Just a few
yeah, the
things.
whole, that whole part of our, of history in general is sort of wrapped up in the Middle Ages. It's not necessarily as clear as we'd want the time frame to be. There was a lot of ideas and a lot of different warring states basically of that. And that was also a time where we had a lot of there was the Black Death. There were several
Mhm.
famines that happened. There were a lot of things that happened, natural disasters, and things that were really challenging for humanity in general. The Mongol Empire was sort of invading China, and there was a lot of distress over um, you know different boundaries being crossed and such. Those types of things were happening. I mean, war is pretty much a part of our whole history. I don't want to say that it's isolated
Yeah.
to that, but there were definitely a lot of clashing ideas and such as well happening. And then we can even see in the 1980s, right? We can see this um, sort of a beginning to glamorize technology. Like technology becomes our false god, right? Technology is the answer to everything. Science and technology becoming the focus, and we can sort of lose touch with the aspects of humanity that are more based on the emotions or based on the grounded aspects. There it can
Right.
become extreme in some regards, so we do want to be careful of that. Saturn Aquarius, that's a very cold sign. It's a cold, dry sign. It's
Mhm.
you know and so there's going to be a lot of ideas that come and spring forth during this time frame, but those ideas can leave out some of the other elements if it gets to an extreme, right?
Well, luckily, we also have other planets too that
Yeah,
help us.
right. We're
So, could you go back in history a little bit and just give us like a brief overview of the different elements and like
well,
what was going on, and then where we're going after this, after we go into this 200-year era element?
we're going to go into water. Well,
Yeah.
um, that was a really interesting journey, just to dive in a little bit and to see historically how these time frames can be associated with the different elements. So, if we go back 800 years or so, we're going back into the 1200s and the 1300s. And I just talked about that a little bit with this Middle Ages that was happening, going on. And there's definitely um, some famine and death and stuff like that, but there was also the introduction of new cultures and bringing in some new innovations and new ideals into that. And then we moved into the water period. So the water period is about the 14 somethings until the 16 somethings. That was in the West, that was the Renaissance period. That was
Mm.
a really interesting time period where there was a rebirth, basically, is what Renaissance relates to, of different um, artistic, scientific, different types of understandings of different types of things. That was, a pretty interesting period. Now, the water has to do with connectivity, right? So we had just talked about that. The water connects things, and um, the water is described as more sensitive, kind of more because you're connected. If you're connected to something, you're going to be more sensitive to it. You're going to understand. There's an understanding element that's going on with it, and the water is also sort of more associated with religions and monarchies and these sort of group things that happen that connect people in general as well. The water element, and there was a huge emphasis on religion during that time period. That time period, um, diving into it a little bit, what I thought was really interesting is that was the time period that the printing press was first invented. And the printing press allowed for massive books, to be printed and shared. And so all of a sudden, people became more connected because they weren't limited, that information wasn't limited to an elite, wealthy only people who had the education. And
So if you could read, then you could read the book. And this was when the Gutenberg Bible was created, right?
Yeah.
That beautiful book.
And a lot of what got printed was the Bible. And so there was a lot of religious information getting circulated around that wasn't as accessible before that. And not only that, everything was written in Latin before that. And so when the printing press came around, people had access to books written in their own language. So their own language, their vernacular language became accessible, and they could read in the language that they knew. So
do you know if this was a period of time where the idea of education, where everyone learns to read, was born?
Well, it definitely was the birth of literacy.
Okay.
And it bolstered the less extremes in the classes. Okay, so that was really interesting, because before you just had like the ruling class and then, the people, right? The serfs. And then when people started becoming more literate and being able to read and being able to understand things themselves, this middle class started springing up. And so, that was more along the lines of everyone becoming educated and sharing information in that way. So I see the water element as being very much the flow of information, right? The flow of knowledge, the flow of information starting to connect people in where it hadn't been, people hadn't been connected before. So that was good.
And then, so after water is fire, is that correct?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, originally, I think everything starts with the fire, because we've got Aries as the first sign of the zodiac. So we're starting with air, right? And then goes into water. But then after water is fire, correct?
And so the last 200 fire period, what was happening then?
Well, the fire period, the fire is characterized as more inspired, passionate, creative, spontaneous,
individualistic,
right?
Freedom based,
also kind of militaristic type of things happening. Let's see. So I thought it was interesting because I had mentioned earlier the gunpowder was discovered in China during the fire period. And so they held on to that one for several hundred years before it really leaked out into the rest of the world. But they had that. And then in the 1600s, the understanding of electricity started happening. So people had already understood that lightning had some sparks, and that there was something connected with that lightning. But it wasn't until the 1600s that all of these experiments started happening, and the term electric and electricity was coined. And it was through studies of electricity and magnets. And so electric is actually Latin for of the amber, or of amber, which has to do with this drawing quality that amber has. So yeah, the electron.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
So, I thought it was really interesting that all of these major experiments, even when Ben Franklin tied the key to the string of the kite and observed that, that was in the 1600s and the 1700s that these experiments happened. So that was a pretty interesting thing to happen during the time frame of fire. There was a lot of development of culture during that time. There was a huge emphasis on literature and theater and visual arts, music, philosophy. All of those things sort of sprang up, after the printing press, and that sort of led to the the knowledge being shared so much. Then we go into this fire element for 200 years, where there's just this surge of creativity, right? It's a very creative time. And also, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just going to ask you to talk about the United States and how this was during the fire period.
Right. So we had, during the water period, we had a lot of European explorations by ship, right? We had Christopher Columbus in the Americas. We had, um, the Vikings, the Nordics. They were all going around by the ocean. That was during the water period. Then during the fire period, we started having a bunch more revolutions, a bunch more of these time frames where there were uprisings. And so one of them, the most well known, is the American Revolution. We had the American Revolutionary War, and that was very much about personal freedoms and the inspiration, the need to sort of break free. Fire is very purifying too. So it doesn't want to it burns anything that's no longer necessary is basically what it does. So there's an element of that fire time period of bringing out personal freedoms and people being willing to.
Well, our Constitution was written during that time period.
Mm-hmm.
That inspiration that you were mentioning.
Yeah,
the Constitution is like one of the most amazing documents on the planet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I even read some in Edith Hathaway's book that she was talking about the fire period as being connected with justice, laws and such. So I think that could be an interesting thing to see, the Constitution being such an inspirational document about laws about human rights and how to live in society together. So I think that that was a really big theme going on during that fire period. We also still had the Vikings going, going everywhere and marauding during this fire period. There was a lot of uprisings in that way too. But there was definitely it was a period of creativity and a lot of inspiration. And then we moved into the Earth. So the Earth period was, right around 1820 until about now, right? So we've been in there, and that's what we saw. So we see these disruption periods, right? So what we see in between the fire period and the Earth period is we have the whole industrial revolution. We have this whole time period where industry just starts springing up. So it's inspired, but it's also organized by the earth element. So we see this overlapping of these two things. And then
what's interesting, I just want to mention here that Mercury is exalted in the earth sign of Virgo, and Mercury rules business. And so that's how it relates to all of this business springing up. It's just.
Yep. There's a lot of business connected with it. It's the earth has to do with material well-being, right? The earth is our security, and it has to do with predictability. The earth signs they can be sort of possessive. This is what I own, this is mine, this is my piece of earth, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So there can be an element of that in there. But during that whole time period, that was the beginning of capitalism. That's the beginning. That's where a lot of these ideals that maybe had come up during different periods, but they really got implemented during that time. And you can see, so in the fire period, we've got the understanding of electricity. It goes into the transition period, and then when we get into the earth period, we've got these electric motors being created. We've got all of this industrialization happening. Everything gets mechanized, so it's able to produce more and more and more. We've got the printing press become steam powered, right? So it becomes more mechanized, so it becomes industrial.
And now it's online.
Yeah, right. Now it's online, which happened during the next air period. So everything sort of starts moving through these different elements of the information getting shared. And it's not like one period is only going to have one thing and the other period's only going to have the other thing, but we can sort of see these underlying themes moving through the different periods that give us an idea of how the elements can pull on humanity a little bit. If you look at some of the some of the types of art, like during the fire period, we have the Baroque style of art coming up. That's such an impassioned, bold, focused on color and drama and all of those types of things. That's a very fire oriented style that's going on in there. So we're moving through these different cycles, and they have these subtle and prominent impacts on our culture and society. So now we're moving into Aquarius, we're moving into air. So the last conjunctions that we had in Earth period happened from 1820 and until now. So that's the 200 period until 2020. In 1980, there was a conjunction in the air. That was the disruptor cycle. So it was a 20-year period. It went from 1980 until 2000. And then in 2000, Jupiter and Saturn conjuncted in Taurus, an earth sign. So the last 20 years has been earth again.
Okay.
It's been in Taurus. And then this conjunction is now moving into air, and it will be in air for the next 200 years.
So would you think then, because this last time that last 2.5 years where Saturn has been in Capricorn, and then Jupiter joined it and Pluto joined it. Mm-hmm. And then Jupiter, we already said that. And then Ketu joined it. That this is why it has been such a tumultuous year, because it's at the end of a long elemental period.
That's one of the reasons. That's probably one of the big reasons, but there's also the planets involved. We had Jupiter, Saturn, and the South Node and Pluto all together in a sign that's ruled by Saturn. That in its own right was its own cycle that we haven't seen for for a long, long time.
Yeah, you mentioned that where there are other cycles happening at the same time.
Yeah.
That's what you're referring to?
Well, there's other cycles, like we have the conjunction of Saturn and Pluto. Okay. So that only happens, that'll happen on average about every 33 years, because Pluto is an erratic orbit. So we don't always know exactly how, but it's on average about 33 years. And then we have Jupiter conjuncting Pluto, and that'll happen about every 12 to 13 years. So those cycles have all happened this year in 2020. And then we had this combination of Jupiter and Pluto and Saturn and the South Node and all of these things. The last time that they were together was in this sign was like 549.
Wow.
That was a long time ago. And then the last time we had them all together in this sign, so tight, so really, really, really close, one on top of the other, was sometime in like 1800 BC. It was so long ago. It was a very, very long time ago. And then we had underlying those cycles, we had the south nodes of all the planets. We had the south node of Jupiter, the south node of Pluto, the south node of Saturn, all together with the south node of the moon, Ketu. That it was just a big deal. It was kind of a big cycle. So that cycle that just happened was sort of its own thing. But now we're moving into, this other cycle of Jupiter, Saturn conjuncting. I think they're all interconnected. They're all very much interconnected. And we're seeing the tension. We're seeing the tension in our society. My dog's barking at that one. But we're seeing this tension because there's a lot of shifting. There's a lot of changes that are on the horizon. Humanity is actually being forced sort of to change its ways. It's being forced to change. So one of the qualities that we might be seeing as the Saturn Jupiter conjunct in the air signs, and especially in Aquarius, is that Aquarius is a sign that is associated with more social needs, more social understanding of
humanitarian.
There's a very humanitarian. When we look at the Vedic explanation of Aquarius, we see Aquarius is connected with pawns and tanks. And pawns and tanks are social containers. They have to do with bringing people together to get their needs met, to get their resources met. And so Aquarius has this reputation of being more of this socialized type of sign. So, but what we're not going to see, I doubt, is a repeat of what's already been done in the past. And we're moving out of the earth. We're moving out of the earth signs, which has been definitely more connected with material and capitalism and these ideals that are based on these types of values. Now we're moving into the air signs. A term that was brought up to me recently that I sort of liked was a term called compassionate capitalism. And it has to do with still the individual freedoms that come with capitalism and the ability to choose. If you want to work hard and you want to make money, you can do that. But the compassion behind it, meaning that we're able to understand that everybody also is entitled to some of these resources, that these resources can be allocated in a way that helps relieve suffering for the humanity. So I see why there's a lot of talk about socialism and a lot of fear around that we're moving into, that there's a potential to move into that ideal. But I don't think it's ever going to be the same as it was in the past. And I think that what we are moving into are changes in our society. We are going to have to look at society as a whole and think about what it is that's going to address some of the needs of society as a whole.
And the huge differences.
Yeah, the huge differences. That's something that gets less and less during the air signs. Saturn may ask us to look at this in a hard way. We may be faced with big picture needs that are happening, and we may have to collectively answer the call. And as we move into more of these air signs, we're going to tend to answer the call with more ideas and more thinking and more
and perhaps experimentation, because Gemini is one of the air signs. Yes. And Gemini's experimentation.
Yes, we have a lot of innovation coming out through the air signs. Air signs are very inspired and they're very revolutionary. They're very much about things that are unique and things that are new. So we're probably going to be exploring things that are unique and things that are new. But I do think that there's going to be a Saturn flavor to this. And so when we see what's going on in the world right now, we can see that the impact of the Saturn, well, first of all, Saturn Pluto, which happened just a little while ago, is a lot of extremes. Pluto will bring in extremes. So we have this sort of extreme authoritarianism going on, this extreme restriction that's happening because of the virus. And then as we move from into Aquarius, there's still going to be this element of extremes in some regards, with some flavor of restriction. Saturn's very much in favor of doing without, right? Of kind of withholding. It's a cold, dry
austerity, fasting.
Fasting and austerity and working really hard and enduring things and that kind of stuff. So Saturn has that flavor to it. So I mean, my theme during this next 20 years is probably going to remember that we're in a Saturn cycle. We do need to pay attention to that Saturn as being the sign ruler in this specific aspect. And there's we want to also be keeping things in balance. So when we bring in these new ideals and these new ways of going, we want to keep our connection to humanity and our connection to the, that each person is experiencing these things and not
that all life is precious.
Yeah, all life is precious, not just
so. Thank you, Channing. This has been really interesting. I so appreciate you doing that research. and then being here and talking about it to us. So if there isn't anything left for you to say, any last words, do you have anything?
No.
Okay, then. Thank you. And until next time, goodbye.